Hello, folks. This is Michael Broussard of Ask a Sex Abuse Survivor. Today, we have Callen Harty, who has graciously agreed to tell his story and take your questions. When you want to ask a question, what you need to do is go down to the bottom of your Zoom window, and you'll see something called Q&A. Just click on that, type in your question, and we'll get to as many of those as we can as we proceed through the interview. Don't wait for Callen or me to stop talking, because we're going to be talking a lot. Just type it in, and when we get to the next break, it'll be right there. And your questions, your comments, your thoughts are incredibly welcome, because that is a major part of this conversation. I'd like to say thank you, Callen. I appreciate you being here. Thank you so much. We usually start these interviews off asking you, if you could, to talk about the abuse you experienced in as much or as little detail as you choose.
All right. You've already given a trigger warning, but I'll just repeat that.
Thank you.
Hopefully people take care of themselves first. So hopefully, in sharing the story, if you are triggered, you can ask Michael a question or step out of the room, whatever you might need to do to take care of yourself first. So let me give a little bit of background about who I am in my childhood, just as background first. I grew up in a little town, small town in Wisconsin, southwestern Wisconsin. My ancestors had settled there in 1827, a generation before Wisconsin was even a state. So the family has been there for many generations now. Grew up in a very strict Irish Catholic family. My mother was extremely Catholic. She'd, say the rosary every day, that kind of thing. My father died when I was 2 years old. So I grew up without a father. And in fact, given the era that I grew up in, I was the only child in my school all the way through graduation who came from a single parent household. Fairly common these days, but back then that was not the case. So my mother was left with 4 children, 8, 6, 2 and 1, or 3 and 2, sorry. I was the youngest at 2. My oldest brother was, I would say, the black sheep of the family. If the police came to our door, it was because they were looking for him for something. When I was about 9 years old, he reached over and touched me through my pants. Nothing further than that, but it made me very uncomfortable, as it would, I think, any child. So I went and I told my mother what had happened. And I didn't have real explicit words for it because I was 9. But I told her, I said, he touched me down there. And her response, I think, changed the whole trajectory of my life. Her response was, "Oh, you shouldn't let him do that to you," which put the onus on me, not on him. And so that filled me with shame. It made me afraid in the future to tell if anything else happened. And if she had responded in a better way, then there may not have been any further abuse. And I don't say this to blame her. She's passed away a few years ago. She grew up in an era where people didn't talk about sex or sex abuse, and she didn't know how to deal with what I told her, I'm sure. Still not a good response, but I don't think she knew what to say or how to respond to that. So somewhere about a year later, when I was 10 years old, my brother asked me if I wanted to play a game. And, if your big brother asks you if you want to play a game, it's like, wow, yeah, of course I do. And then he said to me, well, I need to tie you up for this game. And, we played cops and robbers and cowboys and Indians, so it didn't seem out of the ordinary. So he tied me up, my hands to one piece of furniture, my feet to another, and then sat on my chest and started unbuckling my pants. I fought like hell, but I was 10 and he was 16. I was also a very small 10-year-old. I was like the next to the shortest kid in my class, didn't have a lot of muscle, and he was the tough guy in his class. So I had no way to fight back. I struggled mightily, but I don't, to this day, I didn't see what he was doing. I could only feel it. All I saw was his back. as he was sitting on my chest, and on the wall above him, the crucifix with Jesus looking down at this happening. And that I think, I always say, was the day I lost both my innocence and my faith, because there was this crucifix looking down, and it still happened. He got bolder after that. He would sneak into my bedroom at night and pretend he was an alligator and, reach up and do things. We would often end up in the basement, in the pitch black basement. There was a point where he raped me in that basement, and I screamed as loudly as I could, but we were alone, because we were always alone when that happened. My mother would go grocery shopping or to visit one of her sisters, and he would take advantage of those opportunities. Much happened. This went on for over 7 years, until I was about 17 and a half. It wasn't every day, not even necessarily every week, but it was a lot. And even after he got married and had children of his own and was living in a different city, couple different cities, it still happened when we visited. He would find a way to get us alone and make things happen. So that's pretty much the story. I mean, I don't want to go into the details of every time that I can remember. There's a lot of them that happened, but that obviously, changed my whole life. And I do believe that if my mother had responded differently with, I'm going to go take care of this, something along those lines, things may have been different. They may not have either, because he got in trouble all the time, even after the police visited, or even after my mom punished him. So may not have made a difference anyway, but that's the basic story.
It's interesting because there's this flashpoint you talk about of telling her and the way that she responded and how things might have been different had she responded differently. I find that for myself as well. I think about all these moments and what if these moments had been different, and how would the impact have been on me later in life, and how different would it have been? I know you don't know how it would have been different,
No.
but looking at your adult life, thinking back to if you had told your mother about this and she had said, "Oh my God, that's terrible. I'm going to go talk to him right now. No one is allowed to do that to you." Do you think what kind of impact do you think that would have had in your development or your life as an adult?
Well, I think even if the abuse had not stopped because of that, I wouldn't have had as much self-loathing and shame. I that kind of reaction would have told me that I was a valuable person, and that shouldn't happen to me. Instead, I did not like myself. I hated myself for many years, and as an adult, when I was living in her house, she always said, "You live in my house under my rules until you turn 18." And I did. I was the good altar boy when I was growing up, except for these things that were happening, which were not my fault. But I didn't swear. I didn't drink like everybody else in my town. In fact, I organized the town's first ever non-alcoholic graduation party. Once I turned 18, however, I started smoking pot. I started drinking. I went on a 10-year alcoholic binge. Seriously, was drinking pretty much every night. If I didn't, it was because I was sick or something else was going on where I couldn't. I would drink 18 brandy cokes in a night, 20, 24 some nights. And go to beer bashes on Sunday. The gay bars in my town had 2 beer bashes, and I'd go to one, and then I'd go to the evening one, and almost drink them out of business with the amount of beer that I drank in those days. Tried harder drugs, not a lot, but did, do some harder drugs. I don't know, and I became suicidal at different times. The one thing that I've failed at most gloriously in my life has been suicide. So I actually, I haven't mentioned, but I'm a writer, and one of the plays that I wrote a scene that was really taken pretty much word for word from my life, where the character had decided, it was a comedy. The character had decided he was going to commit suicide, and he found a bunch of pills in a cabinet and downed them all and laid down to go to sleep. And in the morning, he wakes up and it was a bottle of penicillin. And he says to the other person, I can't even kill myself right. You know, a whole bottle of pills, except nobody told me they were penicillin. I didn't fucking get sick for months. You know,
I'm sorry that I laughed, but that's actually a brilliant bit of black comedy. That's wonderful.
as well, I use humor a lot in my life, and I think a lot of survivors do. A lot can't, but a lot do as a defense mechanism, as a way to get at it without having to face it front on, just fully. So yeah, that was actually the audience laughed uproariously every night when that line came up too, because it was true. I actually did that, and I didn't look at the label. I just took the bottle and downed it, and it was penicillin. Another time, you know, I had a razor blade in my hand, and it was a rusty old razor blade. I couldn't get it to cut. I was trying to press, and it was old and dull, I guess. Ended up writing a poem about that because I fell asleep before I, you know, could finish the job. And I ended up writing a poem where the last line is, I awaken with a razor blade beneath my pillow, which is to say that I didn't succeed this time, but I may in the future. I haven't been suicidal in years, and I'm, you know, thankful for that. And I'm thankful that I was a failure at that part of my life, because I've done a lot since, and I've lived a lot since then.
Yeah, I mean, you're out there speaking about survival. You're out there teaching people about survival. You're out there empowering your fellow survivors with your written work and with the presentations you take part in. So yeah, I'm really grateful that you are here for that. So thank you so much. I appreciate that immensely. We have a couple questions here.
Okay. Excuse me.
So Larry says, I often ask myself how older siblings get the idea to molest their little brothers. Depending when the abuse occurred, there would have been no internet, and even porn would have been difficult to access. Do you think perhaps your brother may have been molested himself when he was younger? That's often what occurs.
Yes. In fact, I believed it my whole life, and I believed I knew who did it to him, though I would never say because it's a supposition, not a fact. And I did find out later that he was abused, but again, never found out who did it. So you know, but I was abused, and I don't run around abusing other people either. So it does happen that people who are abused, some will abuse other people, but most of us do not. It was, you know, a horrifying experience, so we don't want to do that to other people. But I do believe that I'm confident that he was abused, and that was a learned behavior, or part of it at least was a learned behavior. I know he used to always get porn mags too, so we didn't have the internet back then, but there was pornography available in printed versions.
Yeah, I mean, what happened to me in the 1970s, in the early 1970s, it started. And yeah, we didn't have the internet, but there was access to that sort of thing. The thing about him being abused and then abusing, and you said, you know, but I didn't do it. And the vast majority of us don't go on to abuse. It was a very hurtful thing that was sort of promoted for many, many years.
Yeah.
I personally think that there's a choice moment for every person like that, whether you choose to do so or not do so. So the agency for what my abuser did, I place at my abuser's, you know, feet. Basically,
Yes.
it's not me, and it's not the abuse he suffered. But I don't know. What do you think about that? You may differ with me completely on that. Go ahead.
No, I absolutely agree. That was his choice to start abusing me. You know, he could have not done that. He could have chosen lots of other paths. You know, just because that happened to him doesn't mean he needed to do it to me. Otherwise, all of us would be abusers as we grew up, which we know is not true. So I do believe that he made that choice. He's made a lot of choices in his life that I think were not good choices.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just one of them.
We have another question here from Talia. She says, fellow suicide failure here too. What happened that changed your mindset from suicide to being glad that you are here? It's amazing she asked that, because I was about to say, after this question, I want to circle back to what changed in your suicidal ideation.
Um, and I wrote a play called Invisible Boy, and this is in there as well. But it's a light. There was a light, a literal light that saved me. The third time that I was about to kill myself, I was living in a co-op with 28 other people. It was late at night. It was 2 a.m. Of course, I was drunk. I went down to the kitchen and got the biggest kitchen knife that I could find and brought it back up to my room, sat on the floor with it at my wrist, going back and forth on whether I should do it or not. But as I had come back upstairs, I had seen a light underneath the door of one of my housemates about 3 doors down on the other side of the hall. And as I'm sitting there, I thought of that light and I set it down. I walked out into the hall, knocked on her door, and she opened the door. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning. She opened the door, thankfully. And she said, "Oh, Callen, what's going on? How could I help you?" And I said, "I can't be alone right now." She said, "Well, come on in." And I sat down in her futon. She sat down across from me. I started crying and must have cried for 20, 30 minutes. She didn't say a word. She just let me be and acknowledged that it was okay without saying anything. After a while, she said, "Would you like to go for a walk?" We went for a walk in silence still, and then came back. I went to my bedroom, fell asleep, and for some reason I realized that I could not do that. That I had life to live. And she didn't say anything. But in her not saying anything, in the way she presented, she let me know that I was important and valuable, and that she would take time for me to be there in whatever way I needed to be, and saved my life, really.
Wow.
I then, I've always been a writer, and I started having some things published and stuff, and that sort of started building my self-confidence. And little by little, I was able to start telling friends, people about what had happened to me as a child. And I know that once you release that, once you put it out there, it can't be taken back. And
Mm-hmm.
once it's out there, then you have to start dealing with it. And once you start dealing with it, you start healing. Once you start healing, you get better. You're not completely better. I don't think that ever happens. There's always going to be moments where we have triggers or whatever, but you start getting better and you start getting more control of your life. And then when I quit drinking, my whole life turned around from there. I hadn't been able to hold down a job. I ended up getting a job that I worked for almost 10 years, and I left just because the company was sold. Then I worked 2.5 years in a really hard job doing peer counseling, gay and lesbian line. And after 2.5 years, it was just too much. But then my next job, I worked for 7 years, and I've been at my current job 16 years. I've been promoted, in every job that I've had. So I've done well for myself after those 3 failed attempts. The third one, I don't know that I'd call it a failed attempt, because I didn't even get to the point where I was trying anything. But I was there mentally. I was, I didn't think anybody cared about me. I didn't think anybody loved me. I didn't love myself. And she showed me that love in a very quiet way.
Can I ask, was she the first person? Because I get the impression what you're saying is, in telling her about your suicidal ideation, you also told her about some of the abuse, or that it had happened. Is
No,
that correct or no?
I didn't tell her anything.
Oh, okay. You just told her that you were in this crisis
And I couldn't be alone.
moment, and you couldn't get through it.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, after I wrote the play, I wrote her an email after years of not having contact with her. We had gone our separate ways. And I just let her know that she was a character in the play. And I, reminded her of that evening and told her, you saved my life and I wanted to thank you for that. And she wrote back saying, I've always wondered what was going on that night, but I didn't want to ask unless you wanted to share. And then she thanked me for letting her know. The first person I told, actually, her name was Lauren, and the first person I ever told was also named Lauren, oddly enough. That was when I was in high school, and I think maybe a junior or senior. And it was building up and building up, and it was like pressure, steam, having to be let out. So we were in the park, sitting in the park in her car, just hanging out, having fun and talking. And I brought it up and I told her what had happened, and then immediately freaked out and told her, you can't ever tell anybody. And her mother was a teacher. If she had told her mother might have done something about it. But I think she honored me asking her not to say anything to anybody. So I also emailed her about the play because she was in that as well. But it was years before I told anybody else after that. It was when I was with my partner of 5 years, Don. We were living in Denver, and he didn't really know how to handle it. But it was me starting to come out of my shell and to reveal. He didn't know how to respond. We were together 5 years. Now my current partner, we've been together for 32 years this June. And he's been so supportive. And so I shared, with different friends and family members, little by little over the years. I got to be able to do that through my writing, because I would incorporate things about it into my own writing that I didn't share with anybody, but that also was my way of getting there too. So I hope that answers your question. I think I went off on a little tangent there.
To me, it all made sense and it all followed. That it's always fascinating to me when survivors tell, who they tell, how they tell. Like you, for me, there was a giant gap. I told somebody, and there was probably 20 or 30 years that went by before I ever told anybody else. So, that's something that I think that happens to a lot of us. Larry has something to say here. He says, I entirely agree on responsibility. He molested you by choice. He could have made the better choice and left you safe, as most big brothers do. Did you ever feel like you were cheated out of an older brother or protective person that maybe other people had in their lives, other kids you knew?
Yeah, especially in our family, without a father figure. He was the oldest child, and he, sort of claimed that mantle of being the father figure in the family, but then didn't live up to that very well, as you know from what I just shared. So yeah, when I was younger, before this started happening, I really looked up to him, and that was shattered with his behavior. I do want to, something just clicked in me that I do want to say, because it's important to me to say. I didn't mention that I'm gay, but it should be pretty clear from saying my partner's name is Brian. But one thing that I always tell folks when I speak, and this is a very important set of sentences, I am not gay because I was abused, and I was not abused because I'm gay. And that, if people don't know that, they need to know it. I was gay before this started happening. I didn't know it till I was 21. But in looking back when I was coming out, I had crushes on boys in second grade. I was gay all along. So the fact that I was gay was not the reason that he abused me. And I did not become gay because he abused me. And I think that's really important for folks to know.
Thank you for saying that. I truly appreciate that, because that's something that I run up against, and I know a lot of us run up against all the time, because there's this, I think, misconception that people who sexually abuse children, if they're men and they abuse boys, they're gay. And I will tell you from personal experience, my abuser was not gay, did not identify as gay. He was an equal opportunity abuser. He abused me, he abused my sister, he abused one of my female cousins, he abused male people in my family. He abused his younger sisters when he was, the adult in the room. So yeah, there's like, thank you for saying that, because it's a total disconnect. There's nothing between predators and sexual orientation. It's not even relevant.
No.
And I feel like I can say that with confidence now without hedging, saying this is what I think. We've both been in this long enough. We know it has nothing to do with sexual orientation. And it's so frustrating when people say they're protecting children by trying to prevent them from knowing. You said you had crushes on boys when you were young. You didn't know that meant you were gay, but you were gay. Well, kids know. They know where they're at, and they, just like little boys have crushes on actresses and actors and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's not something that kids should be barred from knowing about reality and real life. And it's just a fact. And this movement that's been going on, if I can get political for a second, this movement that's going on to try to prevent anyone in their formative years from knowing that gay people exist, for knowing that transgender people exist, all that succeeds in doing is isolating any person who is a child, LGBTQ child, to feel like they're wrong, and they're wrong for their existence.
Yeah, and I didn't recognize I was gay when I was younger because there were no role models on TV. There were no openly gay people where I came from. I came out in 1979, which is only 10 years after Stonewall.
Wow.
And I was, how old in 1969 when Stonewall happened? I was 12. So that didn't affect me in Shullsburg, Wisconsin, when that was happening in New York. I probably didn't even hear about it.
Right, exactly. We were both, it was different generations, but we were both isolated in terms of knowing what was going on in the rest of the country or the rest of the world. I have a very strong memory as a child, feeling like I was the only one this had ever happened to, and therefore that's why no one will ever understand. How did you feel like there were other people out there, or how did you feel?
Nope. I thought I was the only one. I did not think that this could happen to other people. Boy, was I wrong about that. It's an epidemic, really. And it's horrible how many, I was in a play once here in Madison, and three of us went out to a bar afterwards and we were talking. And it's one of the few times that I mentioned that I had been abused between Lauren and later. And the other two at the table, man and woman, both also said they were abused too. And it's like any conversation you have, it's amazing if people are willing to say, that a large number of your friends and neighbors and coworkers have been sexually abused as a child or as an adult. It's just, the numbers are staggering. But when you're in it, and when you're that age and you're a little child, you don't realize that this could happen to other people. You think it's just something horrible happening to you, and that for some reason it's your fault. You bring it on. And, that's one of the things with male survivors in particular, is our bodies can have physical reactions, even when the emotional, spiritual, and other contexts are not there. And that makes you feel like, oh God, then they can say, you want it. I can see you wanted it. This is your fault. And my brother did that to me. He put it back on me, several times in my life.
I hear this from female survivors as well, because there's a disconnect between, if they had an abuser and they felt things during the abuse, like you're talking about, that it blurs lines, and it takes a long time to like sort of grow up and talk to other survivors and learn that bodies have normal reactions, and there's nothing wrong with a reaction to your body. That didn't mean that that didn't mean that you were present and a participant in the abuse in any way. We have another question here. Let me check. This is from Larry. He says, Callen, I recall seeing somewhere that you've written quite a few plays. in addition to the other books you've written. Which of these plays have been published?
Just two. One called Awake, which is a Wisconsin comedy, I guess you could say. It's about a man who his cousin was killed when he came over a hill and hit a cow. But he didn't die by hitting the cow. He died because the cow fell over and milk squirted on the windshield and then he crashed. But the family decides to hold, yeah, sorry, the family decides to hold an old-fashioned Irish wake, and all sorts of shenanigans ensue from that. And then the other play is my autobiographical play about surviving the child sex abuse. It's called Invisible Boy. I realized back in 2008, this is a great story for a health issue, by the way. I had a heart attack in 2008. The story of it is I was on stage in the middle of an opening night performance in the middle of my first of two scenes when the heart attack hit. My character was raising his arm in anger. I thought I pulled a muscle and it hurt like hell, but I finished the scene. I went off stage and I was in horrible pain, changed my clothes, came back on, did my next scene, went off stage, laid down, broke into a cold sweat. My niece, who was directing, asked if I was okay. I said, I'm not sure. All of a sudden, the play is ending, and somebody says, are you okay to do a curtain call? And I'm like, I think the only call better be for an ambulance. Because by then I was realizing I was probably having a heart attack, which my father died of at 41. I should have realized it sooner. Ended up getting a good review out of the play. Got headlines locally for having a heart attack on stage. But after that happened, when you face death that closely, it was 100% blockage in my left coronary. It makes you stop and think, what am I doing with my life? What do I need to do with my life? What's important? What's not important? Who do I love? Who do I not love? What do I need to do? And one of the things I realized was I needed to share my story of my sexual abuse, thinking that I was doing it for other people, which I was, but not realizing how healing it would be for me in the process also. So I wrote it. It was produced at Broome Street Theater here in Madison in 2010. We got decent audiences. It's not a subject that, people are going to rush to come see, but we did get decent audiences, and countless people admitted in the Q&As after the Sunday performances that they were abused, some of them for the first time. Over half the cast and crew ended up coming out as sexual abuse survivors. People would write me emails who didn't know me, just write me an email saying, thank you. I needed this. Here's my story. People sharing with me something they had never shared with anybody else in their life. And that's when I realized, I needed to do more. So since then, I founded a conference here in Madison that lasted for 7 years until COVID on surviving child sex abuse with an emphasis on male survivors. I do a lot of speaking engagements. I wrote a memoir about it as well. That one's called Empty Playground. And I've written a lot of blog posts and essays as well as articles that have been published and poems that have been published about the topic as well, along with my other interests. It's not the only thing that I write about by any means.
I actually strongly recommend to anybody who is here to go to Amazon, search Callen Harty on the web. You're going to find a lot of really amazing things that he has written. And I appreciate the amazing work that you continue to do. You talk about, realizing that this is something that, you felt was an important thing to do in your life and that kind of thing. So you're talking about publicly about this. Do you feel like you learned things you've applied in sort of trigger mitigation and healing? You've learned some of those things from people who've seen you speak, or during conversations when you have spoken, or emails people have sent you, etc.
Yeah, I have. I've learned a lot from speaking, and particularly from people who talk to me afterwards and, hey, can I talk to you a little bit further? An amazing amount. I don't know how I knew this, but when I wrote the play, because I hadn't like seen a therapist or anything at that point, I had done some peer counseling with Male Survivor with one of their groups. If you're not familiar with Male Survivor, it's a great organization, but they have peer groups, and so I'd done a lot of work through that and a lot of work through friends and through my writing, but I had never gone to see a therapist. So where was I going with that? Can't remember where that
We were
started.
talking. The question I asked you had to do with what you had learned from people while you're speaking and while people are
Oh,
emailing you and all those things.
yeah. So I don't know how I knew it, but I knew that people in the audience might get triggered. So I contacted the Rape Crisis Center and WCASA, which is the Wisconsin Coalition Against Sexual Assault, and I asked if they could provide information, if they could provide people to be there in case anybody needed support. So, but I have learned just a lot from doing events like the conferences that I organized. It was called Paths to Healing. And the reason I call it paths plural is because I believe there's no one way to get to your healing. Everybody goes a different route to get there, and some things work for some people and some don't for others. But each of those conferences, we would have 3 tracks: one for survivors, one for professionals, and one for allies and family. And you could pick which pieces you wanted to go to, and you could do like all the ones for survivors, or you could do 2 of the ones for survivors and one for professionals, or one for allies, depending on how they interested you. So I would only speak at the beginning, just introducing the conference. Typically, one year they did ask me to be the keynote, but when after I was done introducing, I'd go to the sessions, and I learned so much from those, just about statistics and about how people are harmed, and every aspect of sexual assault and recovery. And it was an amazing learning experience. It stopped when COVID hit, partially because of COVID, but also because the main agency sponsoring it had federal funding taken away.
Oh,
And another one of the agencies also had funding taken away, and so they couldn't afford to put it on anymore. But I'm happy to say, and I don't know if any of your listeners are anywhere near Wisconsin, but the podcast that I did in January, it'll be on the air next month. The woman who does that does a similar show to yours, where she talks about sexual assault and invites people on to talk. And she devoted this entire year to male survivors. But she now wants to restart that conference in Milwaukee. So that's probably not going to happen this year, or maybe not even next, but 2024 or 2025, it'll probably be back. We're working on it together. So I'm
look at
excited.
what you built. Look at what you did. Look at the inspiration that you have spread around. That's fantastic. That is
Thank you.
fantastic. We have a question here from Larry. He says, I'd like to be in touch with you about the things you've written, if that's okay. I ask because I'm working on a corpus of memoirs, plays, and poetry by male survivors, 1,800 books so far, including 2 of yours. Michael has my contact details. And he's also asking, you mentioned another podcast, and he's actually, Talia is saying, oh, never mind. That was a different question. Let's stop with Larry. And is it okay if he keeps in contact with you and gets information from you about this project he's doing?
Yes. My website is callenharty.com. My email's on there. You can contact me through there, and I don't mind sharing my email at all. So you can do that, or you can get it from Michael afterwards.
I'm absolutely more than willing to pass on information to anybody who wants it. I'll say again at the end, but you can get me at askasurvivor@gmail.com. That's askasurvivor@gmail.com. That also goes for anybody who wants to do one of these interviews and talk about their survivor story. I'd be more than happy to put you on. Talia says, what is your podcast called and where can I find it?
It's not my podcast. It's Candace. It's Conversations with Candace. So if you do a search on that, you should find it. The one that I recorded is going to be next month during Sexual Assault Awareness Month. I don't have the date on that yet, but she does one every month.
do me a favor here and just shoot that stuff to me in an email, because I'd like to share that through our mailing list.
Sure.
Your session, but also generally what she's doing, because I try to share as much as I can, and connect people together as much as I can.
Cool.
Um, can I ask you, and people have different answers to this, and different survivors, different answers. Um, when you are triggered, can you walk me through an experience you've had where you've been triggered, and then how you have met it and how you have coped with it?
Okay. Um, Immediately when you asked that, a moment popped into my head. Um, I work with a queer youth theater group as well. And one night a few years ago, we were talking before starting, and it was around Halloween. And they started talking about Halloween scare houses, where you go and you get the crap frightened out of you. And all of a sudden, I felt my heart start beating and I started going cold. And I remembered, and I don't know if any sexual assault happened at this juncture, but I believe it probably did, which is why it triggered me. My brother had set up a haunted house in our basement where there was like a table leaf that you walked up, and then all of a sudden, it fell down the other side and there would be noises. And I have a feeling that the end horror of that was getting sexually assaulted again, but I can't say for sure. But when this topic of haunted houses came up, I started freaking. And I typically, when I have a trigger, I go into like frozen mode. I can't do anything. I can't speak. I can't react. I just sort of freeze. In this case, I felt that starting to happen, so I stepped away and I went outside. Happened to look at my Fitbit, and my resting heart rate was like 130. And so I just started breathing, just being very conscious of my breath, just started breathing, got myself down, looked again, and it was back to its normal, like, 70 something or sometimes 60s for me. There was another time when I was with my very first boyfriend, very heavy set person, like my brother, was also big. And he was on top of me, and I had a flashback where he was my brother in that moment. And I literally threw him off of me and ran out into the living room, but then just stood there and froze. He came out and asked what was gone. I couldn't speak. I couldn't tell him what was wrong, because I hadn't dealt with it at that time, and I didn't know how to describe what I was feeling or what happened. And I thought if I told him, he would leave, which he eventually did anyway. But that's another story. So yeah, I don't get triggered a lot, but you never know when it's going to happen. Sometimes a little smell can do it, or just somebody turning their head the right way. You can't prepare for it. It just happens. So for me, the best thing to do when it does happen is just to stop and gather myself and be conscious of my breathing until I get back into myself.
Yeah, getting back into your body, I find that's really helpful and really important to me too when I'm triggered. We were talking earlier about, that it's not a question of going to therapy and becoming healed, and then you're healed and then everything is good. That healing is a continuing thing for you. Would you like to talk a little more about, expand on the how in your life healing is a continuing process and sort of the elements of that?
Yeah, and interestingly, unlike most people, I still have never gone to a therapist. Part of that is trust, because my trust was broken when I was a kid. So I don't trust people I don't know that well. So I don't want to go talk to somebody I don't even know about really deeply personal things. So unfortunately for my friends, I do a lot of talking with my friends and my family members who are supportive. And I do a lot of processing through my writing. That was the way I came out too. Back when I came out, I didn't talk to people about it. I wrote about it, and then I'd go to the library and read about it. And then, once I had accumulated enough knowledge from exploring the library and whatever I could, that's when was able to come out to friends. And I did the same thing with the sexual assault. I did a lot of reading on my own, and then little by little talk to more people. I have a good friend who's a therapist, and I don't make her be a therapist with me, but I do talk with her as I would a friend. And she's been very helpful. My partner, Brian, has been incredibly supportive of me as a survivor and me doing the work that I do as a survivor. Has also been, very supportive of me through my various illnesses and with my writing and with my photography, everything that I do. He's very supportive, and I of him as well. So that's helpful. But yeah, I would say that would be it.
You just talked about various illnesses, and it's come to light through various studies that there is a connection between the emotional, mental impact of abuse and the physical impact of abuse, and what sort of outcomes can happen as an adult, and those include physical illnesses. Do you feel there's a connection between some of the physical things you've had to overcome and the abuse that you experienced?
I think there could be. I wouldn't dismiss it, but I'm not sure. Because I've had sicknesses prior to any of the abuse happening too. I almost died when I was 2 years old. I had scarlet fever, meningitis, and mumps in a 2-week span. And my mom told me I almost died. When I was in 3rd grade, I was in the hospital for something that was apparently really bad. I don't know what it was. As an adult, I had a heart attack, and it might be convenient to say that was related to the abuse, but also my father died of a heart attack at 41. So there's, a genetic component there as well. And I had colon cancer a couple of years ago, which I survived. I'm a tough guy. I'm a survivor. I've survived a lot: car wrecks, alcoholism. But I think there's a distinct possibility that, the trauma, imposed upon one's body, I think does have to have some kind of physical effects. I just, I'm not quite sure what all those might be.
I mean, they're still studying it, but I'm not going to go into it because it's not my interview. But I also have a litany. I have a list of these impacts as well. And I personally feel that it's definitely connected. One of my doctors who was very helpful to me was an integrative medicine specialist, and she was very helpful in sort of seeing everything and how it all related together, as opposed to we're just looking at this right now. I want to ask you what's going to come out to the same question twice, and you'll understand the second time I ask the question. The first question is, what would you say to somebody who has not yet gotten to the point where they've been able to reach out about the abuse they've experienced? What sort of thoughts, reassurances, advice would you have for someone who's in that place?
I would say coming out as a gay person and coming out as a survivor are very similar. And I think you need to do that when you're ready. You can't push yourself to do it just because other people have. You want to make sure you're in a good space for it, if you can. Sometimes it comes out unintentionally, or sometimes, it might come out because somebody else finds out about it. But, be safe about it. Make sure that you're comfortable with it, and that whoever you are coming out to about it is someone you really do know and trust, and who will be supportive. And I think it's important for those who hear somebody saying this happened to me to listen respectfully, to believe, don't judge, and don't do so much talking, but listening, and offer whatever support you can. But yeah, I think when you're ready, find someone trusted, and that someone trusted could be a therapist. You might decide, okay, I'm going to go to a therapist now. It could be your local priest or pastor. It could be your best friend. It could be another family member. Just as long as it's somebody you believe will be supportive. And if they're not, then the next person might be. I can't imagine that they're gonna like completely turn you away, but that does happen too sometimes, as we talked about previously.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you saying that because, that's a reassurance that it's not us. It's people's inability to handle it. And yeah,
Yes.
I got shut up fairly quickly by that sort of thing because I thought it was me. And you did answer both of my questions, which were about coming out as a survivor and coming out as gay, which was going to be my second question. So you were several steps ahead of me there. You're too smart for me. You're too
That's
clever,
funny.
too aware, and too focused. We have a question here. Talia says, are there one or two or more books that you read that were especially helpful to you?
Yes, but I can't remember their titles. Mike Lew, Larry might know the answer to this. There's a guy named Mike Lew, Lew, who wrote a book about it. When I was writing my play, I did a lot of research. One of the things I found interestingly at that time, so back in 2010, I went to Barnes and Noble or one of those huge bookstores, and there was a small section about sexual assault. And within that small section, there was a tiny section on male sexual assault.
Mm-hmm.
So I read what I could from that. And then over the years, I have gotten other books and read those. But Brian will tell you, we'll go see a movie, and 2 days later, he'll be talking about a scene, and I don't remember that scene. I remember the emotional context of things that I read,
Right.
but I don't remember the specifics of read or see. So I'm not remembering the titles of any of them now, but there have been a lot of books. I think if you just do a search online, maybe get some answers from Larry if he has that huge selection. And I know the Male Survivor has a section of their website where they have a lot of books that they've read in advance. They don't just post them there unless
Mm-hmm.
they have checked them out and make sure they're okay to read. So that would be a good spot to get some information as well.
And if I'm remembering correctly, that website is malesurvivor.org. I'm pretty
Correct.
sure from the last
Yeah.
time I visited. We have another question, or maybe it's Larry telling us what the name of that book is.
Okay.
Yes, we've got it. Larry, thank you so much. It's by Mike Lew, Lew, as you said, and it's called Victims No Longer. What an amazing
Yes.
title.
It is. It's a great title. It's a great book. He was one of the keynotes at one of the conferences that we had here in Madison. A very gracious, wonderful man.
Fantastic. Thank you for all you shared today. I truly appreciate it. We're coming up to the end of the hour. And as we're wrapping up, I just want to ask you if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about or you want to share today.
One thing, and maybe other people won't agree with it, but for me, and this is in my play, I had to find forgiveness, and it doesn't work for everybody. But
Mhm.
but for me, I had to do that. And my brothers never apologized, but forgiveness isn't always about them apologizing either. It's about saying this isn't my burden anymore; it's
Mhm.
yours. So I gave that back to him. So he's the one who has to live with what he did. I am also living with it, but I can move past it in different ways. Um, he hasn't dealt with it in any way, and I pity that. But I did forgive him. Um, for me, forgiveness is important, but I know there are some people who can't get there and won't get there, and that's okay too. You have to deal with it in your own way. And if it works for you, great. If it doesn't, that's also great.
Beautifully said. Beautifully said. Exactly. Exactly. And I congratulate you on finding that moment to unburden yourself of that. Now I've got a couple things I just need to tell people about before we go. Um,
Thank you for having me, by the way.
oh, it's been a pleasure. Uh, if you want to know the next time we do one of these, if you want to know when we do an online survivor poetry reading, if you want to do one of these interviews or read poetry online or participate in one of our support groups or any of that stuff, you can subscribe to our mailing list at tinyletter.com/askasurvivor. tinyletter.com/askasurvivor, and you will get notifications about our support groups online and about the Survivor Stories interviews, about poetry readings, about play performances, all the stuff that we do. If you want to get a hold of me because you want to do one of these interviews, or you just have questions, or you're a poet and you want to, whatever, you can get me directly at askasurvivor@gmail.com. That's askasurvivor@gmail.com. Now, I want to say thank you so much, Callen. I appreciate having you here.
Thank you, and happy St. Patrick's Day. It's a
Oh,
big
thank you.
big
Happy
holiday
St.
for
Patrick's
me.
Day to everybody. I forgot it was St. Patrick's Day. I get so into the advocacy stuff that I miss little things like this. Everybody in the world knows except me. But thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who attended. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for your participation. And we hope to see you all at the next one.